This is 247, Leadership, and we're going to go through Goodwin's book about leadership. And what I first want to do is give you some terminology so that we have a context for things. Speaking of which, first thing is context. You really can't study or consider anything in terms of leadership unless you understand that every situation that a leader finds themselves in is going to have a different contextual base. In other words, context like time, era, present situation, a whole host of things that create the background, the environment in which a leader finds himself. So every leader is both limited by and sort of has to structure themselves around the context, the time in which they live, the moment in that time, and all the other structural things that are already in place. It's like walking into a building, and everything that you do inside is a function of the structure as it exists. So when we talk about context, for our purposes, the definition I want you to work off of is the following. It's a non-unique pre-existing condition or conditions, right? We might call the givens, right? And it refers to any pre-existing variable, element, or entity that directly or indirectly bears on the political decision-making process. So what are we saying? That fundamentally, whatever situation exists, and it's pre-existing, you've walked into it. It's not something that's happening in the moment. It's the background. It's the stuff that informs that moment. So it's the given things that a leader finds themselves having to deal with. Variables, elements, or entities, really anything at all. Variable, obviously something that changes. An element is a critical part of any given structure. It's the pieces. Think of it as the bricks in a building. Or entity, sort of a person or thing, that sort of thing, that directly or indirectly bears on the political decision-making process. In other words, if there's something in the contextual base that really doesn't need to be considered, has nothing to do with the situation at hand. So for example, let's just say that the situation we're concerned with is something in the city, a city, detached from or not connected to, say, a rural area. No commonality, no overlapping, nothing. So the contextual base in the city is what's important. Now, there could be a ripple effect, and maybe what goes on in the city can influence what goes on in the rural area. But for our purposes in trying to get our minds around context, that doesn't happen. It's basically set. It affects only the folks in the city, and that's all we have to consider. All right. So that context, we're going to be looking at Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, and FDR. They all had different contextual or context in which the events that we're going to discuss, they dealt with occurring. Today, we're going to also talk about what goes on today politically to draw a comparison because things change over time. And while these are great leaders in terms of how we view the challenges they faced and what they did to overcome those challenges for the country and themselves, that's what we're really looking at. It changes. It's very different today, and we'll talk about that. So we'll discuss these things in step by step, but also, for each of these players, Lincoln and the Roosevelts, we'll look at those things, but we'll also, I'll try my best to incorporate Trump as an example of what happens in sort of the current context, which is much more complicated than it was, say, in Lincoln's time. Technology and so on. But nevertheless, what you'll see is that the fundamental core principles of leadership that existed back then still exist today. And a violation of those principles, oddly enough, regardless of what success you may have, the violation causes, in many cases, insurmountable problems. All right, so context then is that unique set of circumstances that are pre-existing in the structure that the leader is operating in. So, for example, again, if we're talking about Russia, China, Venezuela, it doesn't matter. England, France, they each have a different contextual base. There is overlapping because nations, there's bound to be some overlap, right? Especially today, integrated, community and the like. But for the most part, even if you think about just the language, differences, there are differences. Paths to the present, history that places them where they are. Those things all inform that moment in time we're looking at. So, for example, there is a context, again, for Lincoln that's different than the context for Teddy Roosevelt, and different than the context for FDR. There is overlapping, but there are important differences that you have to consider in each of those. If you look at Trump presently, right, he has a whole different set of contextual issues that he was sort of operating in, as does Biden now. And those differences, although have to be taken into account, the fundamentals, again, this is really important, the fundamentals of leadership are still intact. So while things change around leaders, there are critical, ongoing, always, valuable and important influences based upon understanding these fundamental principles that will bear on your ability to get things done. You'll hear me say this again, but you have to remember, a leader can't lead unless there are followers. People that follow a leader do so in this context. And so their expectations, how they perceive things, it's all influenced by the context, that moment in time. Again, this is so important. I really want to drill down on this. Human beings have limited view. We're short-run beasts extrapolating way into the future. In other words, 70, 80, 90 years is, a human being may live. And we judge everything on, what we've experienced. So having limited experience, we then extrapolate from that to everything. In other words, we're asking people in that moment that have limited experience to be able to understand and make decisions about not only things in that moment, but things down the road. Compare it to some, 12-year-old child who has 12 years of experience viewing the world, okay? And asking them to make decisions 10 years down the road, for 10 years down the road, presently and for 10 years down the road. I don't think we'd entrust that decision to a 12-year-old, pretty much for anything, right? But yet, we make decisions all the time. And so a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old has lived 30 or 40 years, and while they have a broader contextual base, they understand more, it's not comprehensive. No one's is. It's why understanding history is so important. History is a way of sort of catching up. Seeing what went on 50, 60, 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago, and getting some sense of that, because in moving forward, we begin to understand things in greater context. That's the importance of history, is that we learn more by not having to actually live it, but begin to understand it and then see its application presently, or at least we see how it informs what's happening today. If you don't have that, if you've destroyed that, then or manipulated it to such an extreme that there's not much we can learn from it. You don't have it, or you have misinterpreted it. History is critical for that. It's sort of a short course in what's happened to human beings and how we've behaved in different contexts so we can understand it all, at least to some extent. If we take that out of the equation, then you're living with your blinders on, and all you can see is this space here. You don't see this. That's what the history. Complete history that you can grab, maybe wider. And you would go further out if you understood all of history, right? And so we can't and we shouldn't ignore history at all. It's informative. You'll see from this, and the reason why I'm focusing on it is that when we talk about these past presidents as leaders, to understand leadership more, you'll see that there are those things, as I've said, that are consistent that you must have down if you're going to lead effectively. Okay? History informs all of that. Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and FDR, they're going to inform us. By looking at their leadership in their contextual times, we're going to understand by seeing consistencies that led to their success and challenges that they had to overcome, we're going to get a better understanding of, okay, leaders today have to have these qualities and they have to have these approaches, even though the context is different. Why is that? Because human nature is very consistent. There's the one thing that history will teach you is that human beings have pretty much operated same level since the beginning of time. We talked about this in the last lecture about greed and ignorance and fear and all of that. Pretty much human beings, it's great dealing with them or issues around them. I'm not taking myself out of the group here because they're consistent, right? Greed is greed. It'll always be there. It's in our nature, right? Homo sapiens, we basically took care of all the other sapiens. We were a little bit smarter. So Neanderthals and others, it's reasonable, and there's some debate on this, but we pretty much got rid of all of them. So we're left with just us. Us, all of us. We're all Homo sapiens. The rest, all the other sapiens, we've knocked off. But part of our success in doing that, and what we're left dealing with, is our own fear and greed and higher level of intelligence, which I also touched on in another lecture. Okay, so that's context. The second thing we look at, obviously, is issue. There's got to be an issue in that context that we're addressing. Otherwise, there's no discussion here, right? And the issue is nothing more than a public policy challenge, right? Basically, that challenge is given rise to by some sort of generally, conflicted sort of relationship between people or a group, a problem, if you will, right? An impasse that you've got to deal with, and some problem that needs to be fixed. And you fix that through public policies, right? That's how the issue gets addressed. So the issue itself is the public policy challenge. This is the issue, this is the problem, how do we deal with it? So, for example, in Lincoln's time, the issue obviously was the Civil War. In TR's time, it was the coal strike. Those are what we're looking at. In FDR, it was the economy, the Great Depression. And to a lesser extent, in terms of what we're interested in, World War II. Now, so you got a context, you get an issue that arises, right? Now, there's an event. Okay, so what's an event? Remember how I said that the context is non-unique? Well, the event is unique. It's a condition that's created during the decision-making process. We've got this issue, we're trying to resolve it, and we have to, go through a process to decide what policy we're going to create, because the government has to create it. It's not going to work out otherwise unless there's government intervention in resolving the issue. So we got to come up with some policy, right? Policy is just to problem solve. In any government, in any group of people, an unanticipated problem pops up. That's why we're always tweaking things. And the way we deal with that is we create policy. We say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to say this, and this has to happen, and that has to happen, and we'll piece it together. And then we have to adjust it again. We're always adjusting it because just like there are new issues that crop up, there's also, within a given issue, alterations that take place. Pieces we fix, right, constantly. All right, so it's a unique condition to that moment in time, and it's created during the decision-making process. So as we're deciding things, we're trying to figure out how to fix things, issues pop up. So they're unique, right? And they're happening in real time. And that's the thing. We're not walking into it. like we do with context, which is already in place. We're actually, as we're fixing the problem, if you will, other events are happening. We're sort of fixing the bicycle while we're riding it. That's what we're talking about here. But what we're interested in mostly is the decision-making or policy-making process, right? And that how that policy is directly affected by that particular event, right? So it bears on the substance or the effectiveness of the decision-making or policy. So any variable, element, entity, again, that does not exist prior to that issue coming up. So that's the stage you're sitting on. Those are the givens. But now, as you're working on this issue to resolve it, there are events that take place that bear. We don't care about the ones that don't bear on what we're trying to solve, but the ones that are now, coming to the fore that we've got to deal with as we're trying to fix this thing, right? Why is that important? It's important because those things that crop up that are relevant are going to affect how what kind of decision you make around policy and the likelihood of it succeeding, and a whole host of challenges that now pop with. Okay, that being the case, we think about all the various events that might have cropped up during, Lincoln's time and the like. So what's going to happen is you'll see that Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, while they're working on something, they'll either through the actions they've taken or some sort of exogenous event have to change course or have to deal with that new event that is now informing and bearing upon the decision-making process they're making. Think of it this way. You're in the process of negotiating. You've got several players around the table, all that have an interest in resolving the problem before them, okay? And then some event occurs. Someone that's at the table passes away, and they played a critical role in trying to get to and resolve the issue. Now, that event was not obviously in place when you first sat down. Now it's occurred. Now what do? Right? It's an event that triggers an adjustment. So when you think about all public policy that's made, all things that happen under statute or the like, or common law, they happen in the moment. And they're influenced by the moment, and that's why they always have to be tweaked, because as we move down the road, new things happen, things we didn't plan for. And it's impossible to write anything, any kind of statute or any kind of rule at all that's going to be good forever. There's never going to be any need to change it because it's just perfect. It fits in exactly where we need it to fit in. It resolves the problem for all time. That doesn't happen. Life keeps moving forward, and we have to adjust what we've already done. We have to then figure out how to resolve things that are new, that we've not experienced before. History is important for that. It helps us. So it's always moving. And things that happen while you're in the process of resolving the problem, external events, have to be dealt with because they bear, the ones we're interested in, bear on what we're doing. So in that rather gross example of someone dying at the table, right? There's a change. Think of it this way. In Supreme Court's looking at a case, and then something changes. Let's say the law changes while they're looking at a case, and the case is now rendered moot. In other words, there's no case anymore. The problem that was there has been resolved elsewhere, so the court doesn't need to resolve it. So the court says, hey guys, we're done. Congress just wrote this law, they've enacted it, and that makes this whole point moot, so the court does not need to consider it anymore. That's an event. It's a major event, right? All the time, effort, and money to get to the Supreme Court, and now Congress has changed something. The president has signed it into law, and the court says there's a new law. Or something's happened here, and there's a need for us to shift and adjust to what's happened. Okay? So we have the context, which is, it already pre-exists. We have events then that happen in real time that we have to now deal with as we move towards making a decision and creating policy. Right? We've got an issue. We want to address that issue, make things work better, presumably. on whatever level. It could be ethically, or it could be just something as very perfunctory, something like getting the water to run or electricity to to flow freely to certain areas. So you get an issue, and then in real time you've got events that are going to affect the way the decision makers come together to resolve that with some sort of policy. So decision making is nothing more than that process of creating policy that's impacted by the pre-existing conditions, right? The givens, which is the contextual framework, and impacted by events that occur in real time as they're trying to figure out what to do. Okay, so at the end of the day, all law and an interaction that government has is about setting up policy. So all policy is just nothing more than the formulated and enacted legal response flowing from the decision maker to address a specific issue or decision makers. That's all it is. Policy is a problem fixer. It's supposed to be. We want to fix a problem, we come up with policy. So here's the process. Something occurs. There's a problem, okay? And so the government, one of the reasons why it's there, says we've got a problem. We've got a conflict. We have something that needs to be addressed. We need to come up with some way of managing this because it's going to affect things. Now, the situation you're in pre-exists, right? And so you're already limited in terms of what you can or cannot do, right? In some ways, those blinders, actually, as you'll see later on, those blinders limit your ability to, your choices, right? And in fact, that means that if those choices are limited, you're looking at not the complete expanse of, possible outcomes, but very narrow ones. When JFK was president, in the very beginning, he had to make a decision, about Cuba, right, and the invasion by nationals into Cuba, and so he did something very reasonable. He got together his generals, and he said, "Okay, what should we do?" And they gave him a couple of choices about the way we should handle it, right? And those choices, Kennedy assumed, were the full spectrum of choices, and that after being well considered by those that should understand the particular issue, these are the ones we had to choose from. So he chose. And it turned out to be an unmitigated disaster, right? And what he learned from that is you don't trust solely the generals. They're going to come to you and they're going to give you what they see as what's reasonable. And you assume they've given you everything. The problem here is that sometimes you need a screwdriver to fix the problem. But if you ask a hammer, I apologize, but apparently the recording keeps cutting out. So I think I was about 20 minutes into the lecture when it stopped. So I'm going to go starting from transactional leadership and hope that that's sort of the point at which this cut out. Okay, so I apologize, but apparently the recording keeps cutting out. So I think I was about 20 minutes into the lecture when it stopped. So I'm going to go starting from transactional leadership and hope that that's sort of the point at which this cut out. Okay, so